and welcome to another episode of ITC Asia Insights. I'm Tricia, and today we have the privilege of sitting down with David Lynch, Group Chief Technology Officer at bolttech. I think bolttech as a company needs no further introduction, but for those that are new in this space, bolttech is an international insurtech with a mission to build the world's leading technology-enabled ecosystem for protection and insurance. They're headquartered in Singapore and serves customers in 35 markets across North America, Asia, Africa, and Europe. In today's interview with David, we'll discuss on how AI will shape the future of insurance. Without further ado, let's welcome David Lynch. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Tricia.
So first question I think the audience would love to know is, how can AI enhance the accuracy and efficiency of risk assessment processes within the insurance industry?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. There's a plethora of new data streams coming on board as we speak. And I think traditionally our insurance industry has been obsessed with historical data. And I think whilst that historical data remains very, very valuable going forward, it's really these streams of real-time data that are completely changing the way that we think about risk. And a way to think about that, if you look at wearables, if you look at IoT, telematics, or weather data, there's some examples of real-time data sources that are driving this change. And I think it's impossible for humans to make sense of all of this. And that's where the power of AI comes in. It's worth thinking about it also from the perspective of the industry having been somewhat reactive in the past. So the industry has been very good at assessing risk and reacting over that historical data that it's collected over long periods of time. But typically, the industry hasn't adapted to react when something or a risk event was about to happen. And I think predictive AI is at its most powerful when it's going to be applied to these larger data sets that are being enabled by those new streams of data that I spoke about. And then I think there's also the more proactive use of data, which can drive a deeper form of prevention. So you could think about it a little bit like this. How many loss events in the home could have been prevented through education and guiding customers through preventative maintenance? Or would businesses and consumers be better protected from a cyber attack if they had better access to cyber education and monitoring? And I think this is also when generative AI is starting to come in and is going to be extremely powerful as a mode of addressing risk. It's going to help the industry shift left. And that's a term that the software industry has used for a long period of time, which is really about going upstream. AI is arming insurance with the ability to think about risk from the root cause and to build both predictive and preventative capabilities. And a great example of that is AWS Bedrock, a powerful example that can provide seamless access to leading foundational models that can be used to accelerate this change. And I think that the second part of your question, Tricia, was also about efficiency and how that is applied to risk assessment. So we are in a world now where 5G, cloud and edge computing applications and devices are embedded with AI chipsets, and that's the norm. And we've got access to this colossal computing power to be able to synthesize multiple overlapping data streams and converting that into actionable insights and behavioral triggers and interventions. And the traditional view from the insurance value chain is that it's focused around customer onboarding, distribution, pricing, underwriting, claims, and servicing. But I think when insurance companies and insurtechs have the power they do now to rapidly and efficiently make decisions harnessing the power of AI, the value chain starts to shift. And another way of thinking about it fundamentally is, do consumers want a product that is the cheapest for the most amount of coverage? Or do they want a product that gives the consumer the higher probability of avoiding a loss event from occurring? And I think this question fundamentally gives us a view on where the industry is heading thanks to AI.
Thank you, David. And I think, let's go a little bit deep into the question. I think you mentioned on AI-driven predictive analytics as well. And, I think people would, when you kind of like think about AI, you think about fraud detection, right? You think about how do you prevent it. So maybe just simplify the question. In what ways do you think my AI-driven predictive analytics improve fraud detection and prevention in insurance claims?
I think an interesting example to start with would be a new threat vector in the fraud space, which is the use of deepfakes. And I think this can sort of help the audience comprehend wider applications with respect to fraud. Deepfakes have become all the more common in everyday life. And again, artificial intelligence has been the catalyst for this. So corporates, consumers, and especially A-list celebrities are being targeted by these deepfake attacks and impersonations to perpetrate all different kinds of crime and fraud. And I liked a phrase that the BBC used earlier in the year, likening tackling deepfake as an arms race. So in essence, the speed at which the technology is being used to attack or being used for crime or being used for evil demands that our industry, big tech, telcos, we all need to be developing defense systems at the very least at the same pace as these attackers, preferably faster, and also being able to preempt what's coming next. So I think in the example that I just gave, there's money being poured into deepfake detection. And it's fair to say in this domain, attackers right now are leading in the arms race that I spoke about. So there's a gap, and that gap's got to be closed. And I think it also brings out the fact when we think about fraud more broadly, most businesses and consumers today are not well equipped or educated, particularly around some of these new attack vectors. And this is quite scary, thinking through from the viewpoint of some of the broader consequences on society. But essentially, though, it's the same principle that wherever fraud occurs, whatever domain of fraud, that there's a technology or an AI-driven answer to prevent that fraud from happening, or at the very least to provide early detection or insights into probable fraud. One of the deficiencies, again, however, is while the industry has been good at predicting fraud based on historical data sets, we see far fewer examples in the use of real-time data that I spoke about earlier in preventing claims and fraud. So I think, Tricia, this is the new frontier. Much of the focus is going into areas where AI can identify or detect anomalies, or to identify things that have changed that might identify new threat vectors and fraud attempts that existing AI machine learning models simply cannot detect. And I think further on the topic of claims prevention, we need an industry-based response that starts from the point of the customer need. So I think, let's face it, nobody ever wants to make a claim. By the time a claim is made, it means that a loss event's occurred. It means that something adverse has happened. So there's an opportunity here in the minds of customers for insurers and insurtechs to play a far more active role in preventing these claims. And in order to do that, there are some things that need to be in place. We need the availability of those data streams. We need permissioned use of that data by the customer. And we also need permissioned interventions. So those interventions could take place through alerts, through notifications. It could be through education. It could be through simple nudges. And we are seeing some emerging examples in our industry of players that are doing that particularly well. And of course, we need the AI and computing applications to develop these models and to process all of that data in a secure way, whether that's in the cloud or on the edge. So I think hyperscalers like AWS are making this all possible for our industry so we can focus on what we do best, which is protecting the things that businesses and consumers truly value. So I think, Tricia, claims prevention, or I rather think a little bit more broadly on that in terms of loss prevention, because many losses don't result in a claim, interestingly enough, in our industry. But it's probably the domain within the wider sphere of protection where our industry can and ultimately will have the most profound positive impact on humanity through the use of AI. And I'll just maybe ask the audience to pause to think about it a little bit. Imagine the cumulative impact our industry will have on society if we could reduce losses by 50% in home, auto, cyber, device, or whatever other domain of protection that you want to think about. That impact can be absolutely colossal.
Thank you. And I think that kind of naturally leads to my next question as well. What ethical considerations should insurers address when integrating AI algorithms into decision-making processes, particularly regarding issues like bias and privacy?
Definitely emerging topics, and you almost can't pick up any tech media without this subject coming up as a discussion point. But I think let's start with explainability. I think this is a key requirement. Humans need to be able to comprehend and understand how a model works and the reasoning that sits behind that. And the problem, in the absence of that, there's going to be mistrust. And we've already seen many examples of that in earlier large language models that were released with a lack of explainability. There's some pretty good frameworks and examples out there that corporations, including our own industry, can use for the ethical use of AI that help govern this. So these frameworks can be easily adopted, and they help set guardrails for organizations ramping up their AI development efforts. And we've certainly done the same thing inside of bolttech. Similar to the earlier example, there's also a bit of an arms race going on in the ethics space. So in the area of generative AI, some of the models have been found to reinforce bias, not reduce bias, but reinforce it. So almost like the opposite effect. And we know that big tech in this space have had their issues as well. As I mentioned with some of those earlier large language models, which were widely adopted and bias was identified in those models. But there's startups emerging every day, and there's new solutions by the day targeting these ethical areas of AI. And I think it's also worthwhile considering sometimes we expect a lot of machines, just like we expect a lot of humans, but it may not even be possible, certainly not within the near-term future, that these large language models or small language models can be completely removed of bias. And so much reliance is placed on the training data and the technological guardrails that exist in the building of these models. We need to be asking ourselves the question, are we expecting machines or more of machines than we expect of the human race with respect to bias? And it's an interesting field of science that's evolving very fast. But as we've seen in the real world, more organizations seem to be getting it more right these days, I'd say, particularly in the last 6 to 12 months, in really calling out and acknowledging bias where it exists. I think customers are very good at identifying it too. And where it's identified, the retraining of those models and leveraging, in some cases, updated foundational models that have less bias or have lower tolerance levels for bias is an action that I see many organizations are taking. And I think more widely, I think when you think about privacy in this space, people often gravitate to the use of medical data for the purposes of underwriting and risk selection. I think regulation can and needs to play a role here. I think we have a responsibility to the industry that we use this data in an aggregated form, not in a personally identifiable form, to build out pricing and underwriting models. But particularly in domains such as health, there are very questionable ethics if that data starts to be used for declining insurance or removing access to insurance for some of the people that would most need it. So that's a broader ethical consideration. And I think there are wider ethics frameworks that organizations need to rely upon where it is that regulation and society is just not able to catch up as quickly as the technology is evolving.
Thank you. And I think just to end the interview, we would love to kind of hear from you any practical use cases you've seen on how might AI-powered virtual assistants or chatbots streamline customer service experiences and claim managements for insurance policyholders.
Yeah, I love that question, Tricia. And I've been involved directly in this space for about a decade and a half now, working with some of the earlier incarnations of chatbots using, I would say, far inferior technology to what we have available at our fingertips today. And we've seen that right across fintechs, banks, insurance companies. So it's very commonplace today that all of these organizations are leveraging chatbots in some way, shape, or form. I do think one of the things that's really shifted the thinking a lot is the emergence of generative AI. And theoretically, customer interaction can be 100% driven by a machine today. If you take AWS Bedrock, SageMaker, Poly, Lex, just as some examples of services that AWS have built, insurers today could leverage a mix of these services completely out of the box to totally automate their customer servicing. And you might be asking, why haven't they done it? I'll sort of get to that in a moment, I think. But there's a mix of AI, machine learning models, generative AI, speech to text, text to speech. All of these things are running on the cloud or at the edge. And I think back to an example I gave a bit earlier, if you're not convinced that machines will reach human likeness and interaction in a servicing context, just think back to the deepfake example that I gave previously to see the human likeness that artificial intelligence can generate in that particular domain. It's astonishingly reflective of human-like capability in terms of what we can do today. I think virtual assistants, as I said, can be very human-like now, whether that's in a sales context or whether it's an agency context or whether it's in customer support or other contexts in the value chain. And I think generative AI is also enabling more human-like speech, tone, intonation, and even slang. So customers' willingness to interact with machines, let's say, versus the technology I was using a decade and a half ago, which was far less human-like, is certainly advancing further by the day as well. And of course, on top of that, you've got the advantages that these services powered by AI can be operating 24/7. They can respond instantaneously, and they can respond in multiple languages. We certainly can't change the fact, however, that customers often still like to speak to a human. And we know that particularly the higher the value of the product. So particularly in areas like homeowners and auto, in our industry, humans often like to shop around online. They like to look at different features and pricing, but ultimately many of them like to actually bind the policy after speaking to a human. So I think ultimately for our industry, it's about giving choice and it's about giving convenience to the customer. And ultimately, it's going to be the customers that choose what's the best pathway for themselves. Do they prefer an interaction with a machine that's almost human-like, or do they still prefer an interaction with a human that is heavily augmented with AI in any case? So I'd conclude, I think, on that question, Tricia, by saying I don't believe the technology is the barrier to fully automating customer service anymore. It's the investment appetite. It's the creation of the models. It's the availability of the training data. And ultimately, it's that customer preference that I spoke about earlier. So I'd say in sort of conclusion on that, think about it as well from the viewpoint of the business necessity. There's so many new and interesting micro insurance categories emerging. You think about these things, sort of high volume, low ticket size insurances. And the only way these businesses can survive and thrive is to have a highly automated servicing and claims, where ultimately human energy and human intellect is going to be directed towards solving and handling the most complex problems and use cases rather than low-level conversations and interactions that can be easily and more efficiently handled by a machine.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David. As we wrap up this insightful conversation with David, it's evident that there's a lot of potential on how AI will shape the future of insurance. We hope this discussion has provided valuable insights into the transformative journey of the insurance industry. Stay tuned for more engaging conversations with ITC Asia and join us from 4th to 6th June here in Singapore for our flagship Asia Pacific event. Thank you, David. Thank you.
Thanks, Tricia.